to welcome you again and let you know that I am thrilled to welcome our Metro Board of Trustees member Jim Neal today here for his talk. Fair use is not civil disobedience. Many of you know Mr. Neal as the Vice President for Information Services and University Librarian at Columbia University, where he provides leadership for university academic computing and a system of 22 libraries. His responsibilities include the Columbia Center for New Media Teaching and Learning, the Center for Digital Research and Scholarship, the Copyright Advisory Office, and the Center for Human Rights and Documentation Research. An active member of the professional library community, Jim is also a member of OCLC Board of Trustees, the elected treasurer of the American Library Association, where he also serves on ALA Council and the Executive Board. He was named Academic Librarian of the Year by ACRL in 1997, was a recipient of ALA's Hugh Atkinson Memorial Award, and the 2009 Melville Dewey Medal Award. In 2010, he received the Honorary Doctor of Laws degree from the University of Alberta. And I could truly go on and on with his credentials and everything that he's involved in, but what I'd rather do is have you all join me in welcoming Jim Neal.
Good evening, and I certainly appreciate your coming out on in an evening after many of you have worked to listen to a talk on copyright. That is truly brave. One often thinks about copyright as one of those amigo topics. My eyes glaze over, but I'm trying to keep it exciting for you and very focused on the work that we do in libraries and trying to emphasize how extraordinary lucky we are in the United States to have ingrained in our copyright law Section 107, the section that deals with fair use. My view, which I've articulated several times in writing and in presentations, is that we don't take advantage of what we've been given in our copyright law. And as it has not kept up with the changes that are taking place in terms of digital and networked information, sometimes we have to make hard decisions and risky decisions in terms of how we will provide services and access to the collections for our students and our faculty in the academic setting. I've used the word copyright wars here by design because I think for the last 25 or 30 years we have been very much in a defensive mode in libraries, dealing with the offense coming from the content industry, trying to narrow interpretations of fair use and to apply a much more conservative working environment in libraries, particularly using digital and network information. And I believe there's a very important role that we as academic library and librarians should be playing in not only educating our community about the current environment and some of the copyright issues we're dealing with in higher education, but also to be strongly working in Washington and in the international community in Geneva, where the World Intellectual Property Organization is based, to really achieve the types of laws and court decisions that I think will enable us to do our work. This is a wonderful New Yorker cartoon that one cannot resist. I'm not sure I can help you. All your issues seem to be copyright related. I would say that growing up as a librarian, it was rare that my professional life intersected with copyright. As a matter of fact, we did not have to deal with significant changes in copyright over many decades. But starting in the late 1980s into the early 1990s, as digital and network technologies became more relevant and important, we saw some real legal and legislative initiatives begin to blossom. And by the time we get to the current decade, the issues of copyright, which were sort of back issue articles in law journals, is now pretty much on a daily basis in the New York Times and other newspapers that we read. So it has become a very important, celebrated business and policy issue that covers a lot of the world in which we live. There's reasons why this has become the case. We could all come up with our list of revolutionary changes that are defining our world. Here are a few that I would toss out to you as sort of trends that are very important in driving new thinking around copyright. Some of these are obvious. More people have devices that they have in their offices, in their work life, that they carry around with them. More and more of the information they use is electronic, digital. More and more of it is distributed and shared over networks. More and more of it is linked to devices, iPads, iPhones, and other types of things that we carry around. So they're not work or desk-based, but they're with us all the time. We have a generation of learners and a generation of consumers who have a sort of MTV view of the world, who have grown up with video games and who want a much more interactive and dynamic and multimedia relationship to the information that they use. In the internet world, as we know, everyone is an author or has the potential to be an author. And once we commit something to print, even electronic print, it is owned, it is copyrighted. And so there's a lot of grayness in defining ownership of copyright in a world where anyone can produce and distribute pretty much anything they want. We also have this self-service philosophy. If I can sort of go to the bank at 2 o'clock in the morning and take out a couple $100 and now pay for the privilege of taking my own money, if I can scan my own groceries at the supermarket, if I can take my train or plane ticket out of a machine rather than waiting in those long lines, I brought that self-service approach in all of my interactions. And this, in many ways, touches people's view of how we use information, how we use other people's information. We also have this other war that's been going on, at least in our world of academic libraries, concerning the ownership of scholarly information, the nature of change in the scholarly communication world. But information as a public good versus information as a commodity is very much sitting behind a lot of our debates about the ownership of information, copyright of information. We also have many more students who are entering our universities by not showing up and sitting in classrooms, but because of family life, part-time jobs, etc., they have a much more episodic, much more distant relationship very often with their educational experience. And certainly the growth of online universities and the growth of for-profit universities has driven a lot of new thinking about where information sits in that learning experience. Users watch television, they play video games, they go to the movies, and they see all these extraordinary technologies, and they bring those expectations to their interaction with service organizations like libraries. And we can't always deliver on that because of the investments in technology, but often we can't deliver on it because of the limitations, our perceived limitations of copyright. One of the biggest challenges we face is the issue of how do we deal with information that's been converted from analog to digital, but more importantly, how do we deal with information that's been born digitally? Tweets, blogs, all kinds of websites and web documents, none of which have we thought carefully and systemically about how to preserve for purposes of future use by scholars and students. The fact is, our copyright law does not support a rigorous program of digital preservation. We also have this sense of constant change, of hybrid approaches and hybrid structures. Nothing is ever pinned down. Permanent beta becomes the rhetoric. And copyright, in many ways, was written in a stable world, not one in which information is constantly moving and changing and evolving. And our laws have not kept up with that, therefore the difficulty of applying a lot of it. Lots of information flowing back and forth. It doesn't necessarily flow into the library and then out to a user. There's a lot of peer-to-peer sharing. And certainly we've watched some of our students at our universities in terms of how they share music files and how they share movie files, which has gotten some of them in some legal trouble. We also have had this pressure from the content industry to provide more rigorous levels of security and authentication to make sure that the people who are accessing and using information are authorized to use that information. That's why we sometimes have password access, sometimes we have IP address requirements in terms of licensing content from publishers. The other challenge to copyright is information does not live on its own in a single format. It's linked all together. So one of the joys of working in a networked information world is reading a paper, coming to the end, and link to the references at the end of that paper or at the end of that book, and being able to navigate across a whole variety of information sources. Copyright does not deal with that navigation very well, particularly when it begins to link with different types of multimedia files. We also know that a lot more information is not pull, it's a push. We're moving lots more information, a lot more guidance to our users in terms of RSS feeds and a variety of other technologies and tools where we're trying to keep our users much more up to date and pushing information and pushing approaches to information out to them. We also began to think differently about our users. Most of our experiences in libraries in the 70s and 80s were pretty vanilla experiences. Everyone walked in, they searched the catalog, they went to the shelf, they got the book, they looked for a photocopier that was working, they made a copy and they took it home. Now, photocopiers generated a lot of controversy in the 1976 copyright law, but that pales in comparison to the types of individualized needs and customized requirements that our users bring to the current library setting. And lastly, and again, you could come up with yours, this open revolution, the notion that information wants to be available and accessible to everyone. And certainly the scholarly communication wars, which is a separate talk, has pushed a lot of new thinking about how we enable more and better access to information, open access to information for the communities that we serve. So all of these trends are upsetting some of the traditional thinking and interpretations of copyright. Larry Lessig, the faculty member at the University of Stanford Law School, has done some wonderful thinking. And I love this structure which he's brought to thinking about open access to information. And he basically identifies 4 key barriers, one of which is technology. Think of digital encryption technologies, digital rights management systems that may make it difficult to access and use and share information. Think about the market, the price of information, and how that creates a have and have not type of environment for accessing information. It's one fact that we live with and struggle with all the time in terms of managing our acquisitions budgets in our libraries. The norms. We've always done it this way, and how we break those old behaviors and push people to think differently and not sort of map over their analog behaviors into the digital networked environment. And then he obviously also talks about the laws, particularly the legislative and legal environment of copyright. And it's that segment, that legal law aspect of the barriers to access that we'll focus on today. We're all striving to build this thing we're calling the digital library. We know that in this environment, the real driver is not quality equaling content, but quality equaling content plus functionality. It's not just your ability to deliver the information to me. I want to be able to use it, to apply it, to share it, to distribute it. And it's that functionality piece that has gotten us into some interesting trouble as we look at copyright. Certainly our largest digital collection in every one of our libraries is the material that we license from publishers. And it's very important to remember that when we sign a contract with a publisher, we have given up copyright. We basically have agreed to the terms of that contract. And every library in this room, every individual in this room has signed a different contract and may have very different terms and very different standards by which they need to behave in accessing and using that information. They are not covered under that provision, under that contract by the public law of contract. We also are distributing a lot of the content through digitization out of our own special collections. That's increasingly an important part of the work that we do to provide expanded global access over the internet to our valuable resources. But very often, we can only focus on the material prior to 1923. Some of us have tried to make some risky decisions around what we call orphan work type, or things that were published after 1923 for which we can't locate or determine the copyright owner. We're going to come back to that. Open web content. Think about all the information that's being lost every second of every day. Scholars, students will not have access to it any longer. I think it has a major, it's a major factor in the future integrity of the scholarly process. Think about you writing a paper And at the end of that paper, you cite a half dozen web sources that were part of your evidence that you presented. And I go 6 months later and I read that paper and 4 of them are missing. And I'm going to say, wow, you made this up, because I can't find the data or evidence that you used in presenting your paper. So the whole integrity is at risk. And we do not have, within the current copyright law, the ability to capture, organize, and archive web content, because it is owned by somebody. A website, a web document, and it's a real challenge and a real problem. Yes?
Are you talking also about link fraud, or are you talking about things that just...
I'm talking about websites. I'm talking about blogs. I'm talking about organizational and individual websites. There's a major project going on in Columbia in that area, but I'm really raising it here in the context of the inability of our copyright law to enable us to take care of this material. What challenges us is that more and more of this stuff is multimedia, and different media are governed by different aspects and definitions in copyright. It's integrated with services, so people want to do stuff with it. And increasingly, we can't use digital information unless we have software tools, functionality, which is built into that environment. The preservation issue is extraordinary. We basically failed in preserving long-term our analog, our paper archives, and we have doubly failed in organizing a national strategy around digital preservation. You can't preserve what you don't have, and therefore there's a strong connection we need to rebuild between preservation and collection development. But that aside, one of the challenges of digital preservation is it's not just the persistence of the content, it's the persistence of the ability to search and use that content. So there's a software preservation requirement that goes forward in terms of preserving electronic content. And it's also a security issue. We need to make sure that information is not lost or changed. And certainly with the born digital environment, this is a challenge. And the current provisions for preservation in our copyright law were written in 1970s. And that simply does not map into the type of digital preservation challenges that we're facing today. This whole arena of scholarly communication is linked because one of the reasons we have so much problem with copyright is that our faculty and researchers at our universities give it away. And we've been fighting this battle for a long time, encouraging them to write into their publisher contracts some ability to retain the rights to post those materials in an open access repository, to put it up on their own websites. And with tools like Google Scholar, we have the increasing ability to provide more global open access to this information. But this link between scholarly publishing and copyright is one that I don't think we've done a very good job in educating our faculty and getting them to use things like the Creative Commons license as a tool to retain some of their rights as the author of their work. And then, of course, we have this rhetoric of openness from open source on the software side down to open access on the scholarly publishing side. But openness is something that we as a library community, I think, have a very fundamental responsibility to uphold and advance. I'll pull one or two items out of here. Think of the issue of open course content and the issues that we're facing with e-reserves. We'll come back to that. Think about open design, that is the ability to develop systems and access to information that are supportive of individuals with physical and visual disabilities. And although there are some provisions within our copyright law that make special cutouts for those individuals, it's far less. And we're now beginning to see some major pushback and resistance from publishers in providing, making provision for handicapped individuals and accessing electronic information. And one other piece of this puzzle is the places in which authors and scholars deposit their work. I call this repository chaos. We used to be able to at least depend that people put their work in the publisher repository, and that was the authenticated, reliable place where things did not move or change. But now we put it in disciplinary repositories. Think of the archive for high energy physics and computer science at Cornell. Institutional repositories, we've got one at Columbia, it's called Academic Commons. We've got departments and schools putting up things. People put it on their own personal websites. Communities are building repositories. Countries are demanding that authors and researchers put it up on national websites. NIH is saying if you get money, you got to put it up on. So where's the reliable copy? Which is the one that we're going to preserve? Which ones have different copyright characteristics that we need to think about? It's a chaotic environment, and normally I like chaos. I think it's a good value and but this is an area where I think it's creating extraordinary problems for academic libraries. And lastly, is this whole user expectation. Charles Kuralt, the late newscaster, once noted that thanks to the interstate highway system in the United States, I can travel from New York to San Francisco and see absolutely nothing. The infrastructure is necessary but insufficient. Our users are telling us they want more and better content, they want more and better access, they want to be more productive as individuals and organizations, they want to control in an ATM way their information environments, they want to participate with each other, they want to share information. All of this represents serious threats to copyright as we know it and as we have interpreted it. Okay, so let's turn to the second piece of this talk, and that's copyright. We have to remember that copyright is an exclusive right. It gives to the person who has created the work or the person who ultimately owns that work certain things that only they can do. They can reproduce it, they can distribute it, they can adapt it into some other type of work, they can perform it publicly, or they can display it publicly. This is what the law says. You create it, or you give it to someone else, this is the rights that they carry with it. Thankfully, in American copyright law, we have a broad exemption called fair use. It's Section 107. It is not a right. We often talk about fair use rights. It's a defense. It's basically if you get sued, then you can claim fair use as your defense. And what the courts have said, here are some questions that we consider when we make a decision on whether it's a reliable defense. Why did you use it? What was the purpose of your use? Did you use it in a classroom, or did you reproduce it and sell it all over the world? Important difference between those two purposes. What was the nature of the work that is copyrighted that you used? Is it a 2011 textbook that a publisher is trying to sell, or is it a 1924 book of poems out of which you took one poem? Big difference in the eyes of the courts. How much did you use? Did you use a page, or did you copy the whole work? And most importantly, under American copyright law, built on English common law, is the notion of what impact did this have on the market? Did you take away revenue and sales from the copyright owner? None of these questions on their own, it's really a subjective decision that the courts make, influenced by these types of questions. We also realized in 1976 that with the photocopy machine, lots of issues were coming to the table in terms of the reproduction and distribution of works. And the 1976 law, thankfully, added a provision, it's called Section 108, that basically allowed us to do several things. It allowed people to walk into our libraries and make copies on photocopy equipment if we posted that sign. Remember that sign we have that sitting on all these machines? It allowed us to do interlibrary loan, to actually make copies and send them back and forth. It enabled us to make a copy if a purchased copy became unusable. It enabled us to preserve works and to make copies. Remember, microfilm was the norm at this point, so the law says we could make 3 copies. That is not relevant in a digital environment. So we're living under those analog ideas that existed in the 76 law, but we have these really interesting limitations and exceptions to copyright that are advantageous to the library and archive community. The concept of fixed. What I'm saying here today is not copyrighted, but it's being recorded. So there it's being fixed on film. These slides are fixed. If it's in a computer, it's considered fixed. So you can't have these. I'll sell these to you. No. So it's the fixed nature that really defines what can be copyrighted. If you do those things which are exclusively the right of the copyright owner, and you don't have the agreement of the copyright owner, and you haven't paid for the right to do that, then you have infringed copyright and you're subject to legal action. And that legal action is becoming far more rigorous and far more expensive, and at one point was almost had the risk of becoming criminal charges. We're sort of borderline right now. There is a requirement of originality in American copyright law. It says I can't simply create an alphabetical list like a phone book and copyright that. And there was a very important case in the 1980s that said the white pages of the phone book cannot be copyrighted. The yellow pages can, because of the creativity and design that goes into the various advertisements that exist in those yellow pages. There's also an interesting provision in our law of works for hire, so that if you are an author, but you're being paid by your institution to do that work, then the copyright may not be with you, it may be with your university or your employer. Therefore, it is a work for hire. And there's been lots of interesting court cases around whether faculty represent workers for hire. And the courts have been equivocal on that, and I suspect there's not a faculty member in this country who would consider themselves as a work for hire for any college or university. The last point I'll make here is the concept of public domain. When we wrote into the Constitution, and I believe we're the only country in the world that actually built provisions for copyright in our original Constitution, it says for a limited period. Now, there's all kinds of debates about what did the framers of the Constitution mean by a limited period of time. It was 14 years extended for an additional, renewable for an additional 14 years, and we just kicked it up to life of author plus 70 years with the Sonny Bono term extension bill. There's great debate about whether that is in fact unconstitutional, but we use a provision in this country of 1923 being the cutoff date. So anything prior to 1923 published in the United States, we believe is out of copyright and in the public domain. After 1923, there may be some copyright issues. There's all kinds of issues around movies and sound recordings and works published in other countries, but 23 is a useful guideline. Government publications, US government publications, are in the public domain. State government publications generally are not. So very interesting and important complexities in what is in that public domain. I wrote a paper a number of years ago and published in American Libraries that the title of which was Copyright is Dead, Long Live Copyright. And I basically identified, and you'll understand when I wrote it, my first sentence was, the American library community is confronted by a copyright axis of evil. So you know when I wrote that, back in the days just after 9/11, when the saber rattling was coming out of Washington about certain countries in the world. But this was my axis of evil. These were the things that I thought were particularly threatening to the library community and really undermining our ability to use the exceptions in 108 and the fair use provisions of 107. I was concerned that international agreements would be a real challenge because other countries may develop more conservative approaches to copyright. And Kenny Cruz, who is on my staff at Columbia, just did a study for the World Intellectual Property Organization in which he looked at the copyright laws in 150 countries and found that there are only 6 that have general exceptions in their laws like fair use. So if we create international agreements and the United States is supposed to sign that treaty and agree to those international agreements, are we running the risk of perhaps giving up certain capacities that we have within our US copyright law? We could depend on maybe one major legal and legislative issue every 5 years on copyright. Now they come every day, and I'll talk about some of them. And as we said earlier, it's on the front page of the New York Times. It's not some esoteric legal billable hour type thing that sits on the back of law journals. We also have a lot more court cases. huge interpretations of copyright now coming out of judges' decisions and not out of legislative decisions. And of course, we can get into that debate whether judges should write the laws or interpret the laws as it applies to lots of things in our world, but in copyright, we're seeing judges play a very significant role. We also have, as a country, tried to impose on other countries rights to sell in the American market through these trade agreements and say, we will only give you access to the American market if your copyright law looks like this, and it's not like ours. So they have tried to put very conservative copyright laws in countries, particularly in developing countries around the world, and to me this is copyright imperialism, as I've come to call it. We've talked about licensing agreements, how we now get most of our information in our libraries electronically through contract. There has been a lot of interest to get us to the table to develop use guidelines. We did that in the 1980s under the CONFU discussions, Conference on Fair Use. And we agreed to certain, remember the rule of 5 in interlibrary loan, or no more than X% that we would photocopy to put on reserve. Well, those we thought, oh, these are going to be great floors for us to work from. They became ceilings. And we learned that in the digital environment, we were not going to come to the table and negotiate with publishers on use guidelines. We also have these digital rights management issues. The 1996-7 US copyright law really lays in place a defense of digital rights management technologies, potentially limiting our ability to access information and limiting our ability to use our defense, fair use, and the provisions of Section 108. And then the whole debates around the ownership of copyright. Most universities and colleges have gone through significant discussions over the last decade looking at the relationship between faculty and their university in terms of who owns those copyrights. Most colleges and universities have given to faculty traditional works, books, monographs, journal articles, but have stepped in when there's potentially money to be made, online education and so forth. So it's an interesting debate, I think, which will continue. The international arena is very important. There's basically two traditions in the world. There's the British-US common law tradition, which has economic roots, and then there's the French-European rights of author, which has more of a moral roots, the moral rights of authors. In the British tradition, US tradition, you can give away your copyright. In the moral rights or rights of author tradition, you always are tethered to your work. You always have some influence over how your work is used. So very different. The first international copyright agreement was the Berne Convention in 1886. And 160 countries in the world signed on to that agreement. And when do you think the United States signed on to that agreement? Were we at the table in 1886 agreeing to participate in international copyright? It was 100 years later, not until the 1980s, did the United States step forward and join the community in international agreements. The Hague Convention said, well, Berne is good, but there's no teeth in the law. Anyone can do anything they want. We now need to build some capacity into bringing violators of copyright to legal action in the international community. WIPO held a diplomatic conference in 1996 saying, wait a second, Berne doesn't have any relationship to the digital and networked environment that's developing. I actually was in Geneva for a month as an advisor to the American delegation at that diplomatic conference. And out of that came the new treaty which drove the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in the United States, which we'll get to. There's this World Trade Organization which is trying to draw a relationship between copyright law and trade law, and that's also true in the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas, and these bilateral agreements that the United States is developing with developing countries, which we talked about earlier. So the international arena in terms of the role of the World Intellectual Property Organization expanding, and the relationship between trade, commerce, and the nature of copyright relationships. So here are some things that have been on our minds in the US related to copyright. Issues of orphan works. Are there things that are in copyright that we can't find the person who owns it? or the organization that owns it? And if we can't, shouldn't we have the ability to use that material for education and scholarly purposes? We are running the risk under DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, in not being able to utilize fair use in the digital and networked environment. As you know, the Librarian of Congress is asked every 3 years to visit DMCA and some of its provisions and to take appeals from the community to see if some changes need to be made in the law. It's been a failure. We really haven't. We had some movement the last cycle, but generally we have not gotten favorable decisions. The whole notion that authors, that publishers might embed in technology some device that would monitor what people do. That's what Broadcast Flag is all about. It's a software tool that would tell a publisher if you were violating copyright or misusing the information. Think about the cameras at red lights around the city that take pictures of you as you go through a light, and then a few months later a bill appears in your mail. We all know about electronic reserves. We all have experienced some form of legal action at our institutions around sound and music and movie files passing around. We've had this revolution around open access to government-funded research with NIH and now other agencies perhaps stepping forward. A very important project that was launched by the Copyright Office in 2005 was a 25-person group that was assembled to look at Section 108, those exceptions and limitations in the law that benefit libraries and archives, and see if they could update that to reflect the new digital networked environment. I'm going to come back to this because it's very important. I was on that committee, and we met in Washington once a month for 3 years. It was ugly, and I'll tell you why it was ugly. The pro-IP enforcement is the appointment of a copyright czar, an intellectual property czar in the White House, and the effort to really build more rigorous monitoring and more higher levels of financial penalty and perhaps even criminal penalties for violations of copyright. And then, of course, we have this extraordinary Google digitization agreement case, which I'll come back to, which continues to drift along and even now may produce some interesting outcomes in terms of applying fair use. So, what are orphan works? It's the things that we can't identify. Why are they important? Because there's lots of things in our collection that we want to digitize and make available to not only our users, but to users all over the world. The Library of Congress did a study about 5 years ago and said this is really, really important, and we've got to find a way to move orphan works legislation through Congress. Legislation was proposed, the law failed. Why did it fail? Because there were large communities of authors who thought this would kill their business. Photographers were the principal organization that lobbied against this bill. You know, photographs are very hard to, and looking at them, determine who actually owns them. But you know what ultimately killed it? Look at your clothes, and look at the patterns and colors and the combination of textures. It was the clothing manufacturers who saw this as copyrighted information. And certainly they're orphan works, because we're not quite sure who created these patterns and colors together. So we're still dealing with an orphan works condition that is ambiguous and not legislatively authorized. We are obviously concerned about the sustainability of fair use. We're worried about technologies that cut off our ability to exercise fair use. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act in some ways made it even more complicated and difficult. This is the thing that the Librarian of Congress works on. It's that Section 1201 in the law that says I can break the law by going around this technology to do certain things. And that's where we've had really no favorable intervention by the Librarian of Congress. We give up fair use when we sign a contract, although we can fight for fair use in the language of that contract. None of us do that. We've had legislation pushes and pulls. We've had the content community trying to restrict fair use. We've had the user community, the public interest community fighting back to preserve and extend fair use. Laws have come up almost 2 or 3 times a year. None of them were passed because everyone sees it as pulling it out of balance. And balance is one of the key words in American copyright law. How do we make sure that the interest of the creators and owners of information are balanced against the consumers and users of information? And that's where libraries, I think, play a very, very central role. We talked about this broadcast flag. The Federal Communications Commission was one of the organizations in Washington that was pushing this notion of embedding in technology some monitoring device. We, the American Library Association, filed a lawsuit. We actually got it to the Supreme Court, which actually denied the notion of broadcast flag as an invasion of privacy, and therefore it was never implemented. But there's these continuing hearings in Washington, and certainly the computer and electronic industry was on our side in this fight, because they thought they would have to incur more cost in putting this type of technology into their products, and they didn't want to do that. Electronic reserves. Clearly, we want to provide as much as we can to our faculty and students without the restrictions of time and space. They don't have to come to the library. They don't have to come in when we're open. The TEACH Act of 2002, which was an effort to try to expand access to information in online learning environments, has been a total failure. You have to sign on to TEACH. You have to say, our institution will abide by the provisions of the TEACH Act, and very, very few, if any, institutions have done that. They have fallen back on interpretations of fair use. Publishers have been very aggressive on this, as we all know. I'll come back later to the current case in Georgia. It's been very much heightened by the increasing prevalence of course management systems, where it's relatively easy to embed and deliver electronic materials for the class. And again, this was where we were really being pulled to the table to come up with user guidelines or best practices, and we have fought that off. One of the biggest challenges in electronic reserves is we are generally responsible agents in libraries, knowing how to work with information and make it available, whereas faculty just, they go willy-nilly, and very often they get themselves and their institutions in trouble, and that's been the source of some of the lawsuits. P2P technologies are still relevant and important, allows information to flow back and forth between individuals, between users of information. It has great relevance in the library and education communities in terms of collaborative learning and collaborative work. The content industries are obviously concerned because it allows people to be pirates and to use information without authorization or without payment. There was a real move in Washington to bring the higher education and the entertainment industries together to see if they can work out something. And there were lots of threats of legislation and lawsuits, and several thousand students at Columbia, as true of many universities around the country, were actually taken to court and had to write out big checks to satisfy those copyright complaints that were brought by movie producers and recording studios. Campuses have made some provisions in terms of narrowing the bandwidth, closing down internet access in some dormitories, setting in place certain use guidelines, threatening students with dismissal from the university if they break the law. So really a lot of push and pull, and it continues to be a challenge. We're beginning to see the industry develop the right business models for streaming video and streaming sound that hopefully will abrogate some of this activity. And of course, we've talked about the NIH provision. You get money from the government, you must put your paper into PubMed Central. We've had several efforts of the Federal Research Public Access Act, FERPA, which has been our effort to generalize that across all federal funding agencies. This is pretty much dead in the water now. Congress can't deal with anything, much less these complex issues like open access to information. This issue around copyright enforcement and the expanded investigative powers that agencies of the government are taking on, I mean, it's pretty scary that White House and FBI are focused on copyright violations. I find it scary, and I think that's why we need to be so aggressive. Here are some really interesting court cases that capture some of these trends and these issues. We all know about the Google book settlement. This was universities around the world, around the United States and the world, that were making content available for their collections for Google to digitize. Some only put forward out of copyright content, Columbia. Some put in lots of in-copyright content, University of California, Michigan, a case in point, and they were sued by publishers and authors that said, you can't digitize our stuff without permission, you're putting it up and people are searching it and you're indexing it and you're showing snippets, a new vocabulary word that came out of this debate, and we're going to sue you. And we thought this would be a very interesting fair use case, that it would raise the question, perhaps even to the Supreme Court, whether the digitization of material, in fact, was a violation of copyright. They had a settlement that they worked out, an ugly settlement in my view, I'll come back to it, and the judge, Judge Chin, who actually was also the judge in the Madoff case, ruled that the settlement was not acceptable. And so it went on. Another interesting one, I'll pick a couple of these out, is AIM versus UCLA. This was actually a suit against UCLA for making streaming video available to students in classes as part of electronic reserves. And the media industry took them to court. And today, the judge threw the case out. And so this was a real victory in a very winter of favorable decisions about copyright that gave us some hope that we might see some courts exercise a little bit of leadership on fair use issues. And of course, last week, let me go up to the Georgia State case. This was the e-reserve case, the celebrated e-reserve case in Georgia, where a group of publishers sued them for putting up electronic reserves without permission. Kenny Cruz at Columbia was the lawyer for the state of Georgia, and they actually put together a set of guidelines on how the universities across the state would make materials available through technology, and the judge has not ruled as yet. She seems to be taking this on as a major fair use case, which will be very interesting or perhaps very troubling. We'll see how it works out. The other one I want to mention here is the Authors Guild versus HathiTrust. This happened a week and a half ago. This is a group of publishers and authors, including a Columbia author, very interestingly, who basically said, Hathi, you're taking these files from Google and you're allowing people to search them. So you're as guilty as Google is, and so therefore we're going to sue you. This is a very interesting case. The rhetoric around it dealt with orphan works, although it has really nothing to do with the court case. I think there was a concern by the authors that under the Google book settlement, the publishers and Google were going to work out an agreement and the authors were going to be left out of it. I think this was the authors saying, hey, we're here, we have a right here too, and we're going to get in on this legal game by filing a separate suit. So it's publishers and individual authors filing a suit against HathiTrust, Michigan, University of California, and 5 individual institutions, all of which have given in-copyright content to Google and is now accessible and readable through HathiTrust. Really interesting case, just started in the last couple of weeks. I worry about the Google agreement. A slide I often use to talk about this, we have to remember where's the money. Remember, under the agreement, Google would be able to put ads into their database. This would be a source of revenue. How many of us want to look at collections of books online and be faced with ads as we read that? We would pay institutional subscriptions to actually access the Google database. And there would be a separate board that would be set up to monitor the price and set up the allocation of assets between authors and publishers. They wanted to compete with Amazon. They saw the Google Book database as a place where they could actually become the major electronic book publisher. And obviously in the last year, they've stepped up with a major electronic book sales program, and they saw the Google Book thing as a big part of it. And then the book rights registry, where 63% of the revenue would go to authors and publishers, and 37% of the revenue in the initial agreement would come to Google. So this is not about the grandiose notion that we want to provide access to the world. There's a lot of money bundled up in this decision, and that's why it has taken years and years to get nowhere. It also raises tough issues. We didn't deal with the fair use issue. We didn't deal with the orphan works issue. We have serious concerns about user privacy, because when we search Google, whether we like it or not, they are keeping information about what we searched. We make that personal choice. We take that personal risk. And this is a violation of that library tradition where we don't tell people what people are reading. That was a major problem here. They had, under the agreement, the ability to take down up to 15% of the content. Why would they choose to take this book down and not this book? Is it censorship? Are there intellectual freedom issues that are bundled up in how those decisions would make? They were going to set a price for accessing the database. I think we're somewhat beyond the digital divide in the access and quality of access to the internet that's enjoyed around the world. I think there's still problems. But this was creating a knowledge divide. That is, if you could afford it and you could access this and make it available in your library to your faculty and students, you would have this extraordinary database of millions and millions and millions of electronic books. If you were at a poor institution and couldn't afford it, you could not. And this I think, is the real powerful issue going forward in dividing the world up in terms of knowledge access. And then there were lots of antitrust concerns, particularly Google's ability to control all of these orphan works, estimated to be almost 3 million orphan works in the Google database. So really interesting debate whether this was really a library for research and browsing, a bookstore that Google was trying to advance, or an effort to put book collections from these libraries all over the world into the cloud as a networked resource that we would share. I don't think we ever got an answer to what Google really wanted to happen. The licensing arrangements, I think, are a sidebar, but still important to continue to keep in mind. It's a legal issue. What we negotiate is what we can do. It's a contract. It's an economic issue. Those who can pay more get more. And certainly we come together in consortiums to try to leverage our economic clout. It's a political issue in the sense that if you have more ability in that negotiation to affect fair use in the types of terms that are in those contracts, you'll be able to provide better access. It's a psychological issue. Generally, we're not willing to get up and do this to the publisher and walk away from those negotiations. So how strong are you? How good a negotiator are you? How powerful are you in those working relationships? And I think it's that knowledge divide issue in terms of whether it's a pressing social question. Let me deal with Section 108, because I think it's an interesting case study. What is 108? As we've noted, it's those provisions in our law that allow us in libraries and archives to do certain things. It's that balancing between the public interest and the publisher interest. And it really puts limitations on the exclusive rights. There's no relationship between 107 and 108. This is a separate set of provisions, not fair use. And it is whatever you sign in a contract is what you agree to. You give up 107, you give up 108 based on what that contract says. So 108 is a very interesting and important part of our law. This group, as I said, was convened in 2005. It was asked to study 108 and the various exceptions and limitations that are in the law, to look at some of the ambiguities and clarifications that would be helpful, and to submit our recommendations to the Library of Congress 2 years later. This is the membership. So it reflected all of the interests, the library community, the museum community, the Walt Disney lawyer was there, the Elsevier staff was there, all the interests were around the table. It was kind of scary to spend so much time with all of those extraordinary content publishers people like. We met for 2 years. The expectation is that we would meet for 2 years. We met for 3 years. We would produce lots of interesting white papers. We'd bring all kinds of experts in. We'd hold roundtables all over the country, and then we would take written testimony from people all over the country. We had a huge database of information based on this investigative work that we did. 108 is interesting. There's an evolution from the original Copyright Act of 1909 down to the Copyright Act of 1976, when we knew that something was going on in terms of the ability to reproduce and distribute information. But we had this crazy thing called the Gentleman's Agreement, which was a sort of the library and publishers sort of shook hands behind the scenes saying, we won't break your law if you won't make it too hard for us. And all kinds of efforts until this Williams and Wilkins case at NYU, which talked about the copying of materials, creating almost like course pack type capabilities. And therefore, the 76 law came into play. We've had it eroded. 108 has been eroded by DMCA. And it has been eroded because of the extension of the protection time by 20 years. So there's a lot of history behind 108. 108 is what tells us what we can do as an exception, particularly important for preservation, particularly for users who are making copies. It also has interesting relationships to newscasts, which only because there was a senator from Tennessee who wanted to have an archive at Vanderbilt University protected. We think our laws are made for all of us, but they're not. They're made for a particular special interest. Look at the pork. This was a piece of pork that was written into Section 108 when it was developed. There were issues with agreement, but like with anything, it's all in the details. Museums should be eligible. They were not covered under 108. We should be able to outsource work, and the companies we outsource that work to should be covered by 108. The notion of 3-copy limit, which was a microfilming standard, needs to be thrown out, because when we make copies in the electronic world, it's constantly making copies. We need to be able to redefine what fragility is in an electronic environment. It's not that a book is falling apart, it's what is happening to electronic information. And lots of other interesting provisions. We have in our law another interesting provision called first sale, which basically says, I can buy something and then I can loan it to you. That's the basis on which libraries lend materials out and people bring them back. Or it's what enables me to buy stuff and then have a garage sale, and you can come and buy it and I can let you walk away with it. We don't know how that works in an electronic environment. It probably doesn't work with ebooks. The publishers would freak out if I could buy something and then give it to you. So those were the tough issues. The preservation of publicly disseminated works, websites. Lots of interesting issues around the cameras and personal digitizing devices that people are bringing into libraries, personal scanners. And the law doesn't deal with those types of issues. These were totally off the wall. They would not talk to us about digital technologies in interlibrary loan, where all of us are breaking that law every day in terms of sharing information digitally. They would not even consider how we make provision for graphical and audiovisual works to make copies for users. That is, if somebody wants a copy of a film, under 108, we don't have the ability to give them a copy of that film. So lots of interesting, interesting things, and I'm going to browse through here. The Librarian of Congress and Copyright Office were planned to take over this process, and they were supposed to hold new roundtables and take public comment about the recommendations. This report, the Section 108 report, is on the web and is a good read if you're interested in various copyright issues. It was supposed to lead to legislative proposals, congressional hearings, the debates in the political process, and to implement changes in the laws. And to really then allow us in libraries, archives, and museums, the LAMs, to really work out the details of how we would implement that in our settings. Nothing got done. 108 got dropped like a hot potato. Interesting. We were told, remember there was these 25 people who were meeting every month for 3 years. And so we would go to Washington most of the time for those meetings. Sometimes they came to New York, but most of the time in Washington. And we were warned, you can never get together in small groups to talk about and be prepared for the next day. And so the librarians and the archivists would, we'll meet at this restaurant and don't tell anybody. And so we would cluster around the table at, and then all of a sudden, the publishers and the content people would come in having their own little cloistered meeting as well. And so there was a lot of backroom work going on. I'm concerned we really were not bold enough. We didn't really take this opportunity to rethink what the nature and purpose of exceptions in our law is all about. we basically retreated into what I call impotent models and structures and the comfort of disagreeing camps. And it was all about disagreeing camps. We became very much involved in process and politics very early in this 108 study group. Maybe we should have refused to engage. Maybe we should have never gone through this process and say, we don't want to talk about 108. We like it as it is. We're interpreting it, we're taking the right risks, and we're just going to do what we do in our libraries. But the notion is, this is all about hardball. This is all about very hot political, economic issues that we as librarians are generally not prepared to play. When I was in Maryland, there was a piece of legislation called UCITA, the Uniform Computer Information Transactions Act. It was basically designed to make legal click-through licenses on the web and shrink-wrap licenses in products. And because it was seen as interstate commerce, it had to be done on a state-by-state basis under the Uniform Commercial Code. Virginia passed the legislation, the notion that it would go through all 50 states, and Maryland was next, and I was working at Hopkins. And the legislature was being pressured by the governor, saying, we cannot be a modern state attracting business unless we pass this law. The library community rose up and said, this is nuts. We can't have this law. And the governor said, all right, you public librarians, all right, you librarians from public universities, if you show up in Annapolis to oppose this law, it will be reflected in your budgets next year. So, hardball. So I was at Hopkins, a private university, so I could go to Annapolis and work on this. And I was there maybe with one or two other people. There were hundreds of lobbyists from the content industry living in the hotels in Annapolis for many weeks. I would argue that when the process was launched, it would have passed unanimously because of the governors and the legislative pressure. After all the debates went forward, we only lost by 7 votes. But even though we lost, it sent a message across the country. And no other state after Maryland approved the UCITA legislation, therefore showing the critical importance of hardball and the legislative process. So we have some tough issues, and this is where I'm coming to the end of the talk. Can digital and network distribution and copying be advanced in a balanced way? If we want to take digital information and send it out to an appropriate group of students or faculty, is that a balanced strategy that content owners would allow us to do? No. Can international copyright agreements be developed that do not undermine our national traditions and values? I am concerned. There is a treaty now in WIPO to establish a set of standards for exceptions and limitations in the law. I worry. Can fair use and access prohibitions be sustained compatibility? Can we exercise fair use without people saying we're breaking the law by sending materials over the internet to people around the world? There's a provision in the DMCA that as an internet service provider, university, we are legally liable if someone breaks the law at our institution and we don't take certain actions, like posting a contact person at our institution that a publisher can be in touch with if they see a violation. Having in place rules and procedures that allows us to follow up on that complaint. Very interesting and important topics. Copyright protection. How long are we going to deal with the length of protection? It's almost become foolish that every time Disney or Gershwin bumps up against that term limit, Congress responds and pushes it a little bit further. It was very interesting in the last month, the European Union just extended by an additional 20 years the protection for sound recordings because the Beatles were coming on the market. Very interesting stuff. Is there going to be a public domain? Is it going to exist? If we keep extending the term, that's a problem. What about these orphan works, the things that we don't know whether they have an owner that we can figure out? And when are we going to work real hard in these licenses and contracts to make sure that we don't give up the exceptions and limitations and the defense of fair use? I'm going to braze through this. We have taken on a major information policy role in libraries. It's not just fighting the copyright wars, it's really being very active in the public interest around all of these tough issues of intellectual freedom and privacy, funding for education and research, telecommunications policy, government information, internet development. We care about these issues because they affect our ability to serve our faculty and students. It's very hard for us as librarians. It's even harder for the ALA Washington office to be involved across all of these issues. So we make hard choices in terms of what we will fight for. I think we need to be knowledgeable. We need to understand these issues. We need to be able to provide accurate and current information to the communities that we serve. We've got to work for the public interest in political action. We've got to educate our users and tell them what is responsible behavior in using other people's copyrights. I think that's the balance that we're trying to achieve. When copyright laws are changed, we need to understand what's the impact on our ability to serve our users, our faculty and students, and to document it, because that's what will influence legislators and Congress as they consider legislation. Let's not give up our rights as we negotiate licenses. Let's use our economic clout. The billions and billions of dollars that we spend collectively as libraries on information, you think it would translate into better terms and better prices. And let's really put our weight behind open models of access to information. Some of us have stepped up the battle and have created copyright advisory offices in our libraries. So Kenny Cruz works for me at Columbia, and he has created this copyright advisory office, which does a lot of the monitoring, lots of advising within the library and across the campus on policy development. He does a lot of work with evaluating our licenses, assisting our faculty and students with permissions processes, and working with the University Council on protecting university copyrights. All of this is, he's not the University Council, he does not make decisions for the university, but the University Council grossly depends on him, and I'm thankful for that, to help interpret copyright for purposes of education and research. So let me suggest some closing reflections. We are good on theses. We know how to write great documents. We need to learn how to scream more, because as Emerson tells us, sometimes a scream is better. And scream carries some important weight in Washington. We learned this through the 108 process. It's a 300-page document. If a lot of cures are suggested for a disease, it means that the disease is incurable. Chekhov told us that. We need to sort of try to keep it simple and focus on the things that really matter to the public interest in the copyright environment. Every war has been preceded by a peace conference. That's what always starts the new war. Will Rogers, thankfully. But you know, the peace conference after World War I is what ultimately contributed to the World War II, and the same thing holds in the political wars. And my parting blow is fair use is not civil disobedience. By exercising fair use, by using it as a legitimate defense, we are operating under the law. I did a paper several months ago published in Educause magazine, in which I talked about systemic change in academic libraries. And my last point was the need for the library community to sort of move beyond education and advocacy in the political process, and to really think about what matters in American politics. What's the most important and influential factor in American politics? Money. Money. And is it time for us to form a political action committee, a PAC, which works with legislators who advocate our positions and influences legislators to vote at the state and national level on legislation that supports our needs, and our needs are our students' and faculty's needs. It's a tough strategy, one that in most audiences I don't get a whole lot of positive reaction, because it means that we have to put that money forward. Our institutions can't put, that's people writing checks, and we're not the most well-paid profession, but this is how people get things done in this country through the political process. So those are some of my thoughts. I'll be interested in your reactions, your comments, and your questions. Thank you.